Good evening, Usher.
How's it going, Rabbi?
Okay, doing okay.
Right.
So an interesting topic.
I think so.
So let me start by saying that I had a conversation with a woman in Ecuador who converted and was very surprised when I recently told her that Judaism views Jews and Gentiles as exact equals. What do you hear in your neck of the woods from?
You're saying that she was surprised to hear that. It's very surprising to hear a rabbi give a rational response to almost anything nowadays, because everything is sort of bundled into fluff, into medrash, into things that's not the ikr of Judaism. But yes, I deal with a lot of converts. I mean, mind you, the average Gentile doesn't even know you could convert to Judaism, right? So they're coming to this whole ordeal with this idea that the Jewish people are a race. And not just a race, I mean, if they came from a Christian background, a superior race, right? Because I think no other book in history has pushed this idea more than the New Testament that there are Jews and there are Gentiles. Well, the Torah really doesn't separate the world between Jew and Gentile, but between the decent and the indecent. And those who have Torah are the decent, and those who are lacking Torah are, for all intents and purposes, the indecent that the decent should be bringing closer to Torah.
Right.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I mean, you're aware about how many times the Torah makes a statement, Keger Ke'ezrach, just like it says Torah Achas. There should be one Torah for the convert, and the same Torah is kept by the born Jew. So God Himself is telling you that both individuals have the same capacity. And I mean, that's a very important lesson. That's coming right from God.
Right. I think that people get confused there on the term ger. What ger is it talking about? The ger hagar or the ger toshav? Because we know some gerim are allowed to eat nevela, while some gerim aren't. I think, according to the Pashat, it's referring to the heir of Rav, to people who left Mitzrayim, who also said Nasev and Ishma, who accepted Torah upon themselves, and it's not really making a classification, an allowance for Gentiles who haven't entered the covenant to also keep the covenant. So for sure, I mean, there's definitely one Torah. I mean, mind you, there's really only one covenant, one promise that God made with humanity outside of the rainbow covenant that he would not destroy the world with the flood. But there's only one revelation, like it says in Mor Nevuchim, that God made with humanity, and that was Har Sinai. And anything outside of that lacks. So the problem I have is when people offer some other movement as an alternative to someone who's already convinced of Judaism. They're offering them a different derech. Now, this appears nowhere in halacha. As a matter of fact, whoever does this breaks halacha. Now, the Rambam
What
writes
type
in
of different path, different derech are you referring to?
right path. Yeah. So the Rambam writes in Hilchos Tshuva, it says that someone who keeps people from performing mitzvot loses their chelik in olam haba. And I think this falls under that rubric. The halacha is clear with how we treat Gentiles when they come to convert. It appears in Asurbia chapter 14. It appears in with the Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah with Simon 268, with Yevamos 47. It's clear. When someone comes to convert, you never mention the Noahide laws. You never mention another path. And the Rambam says why. He says that we don't overburden him with too much information, lest he turn from the good path that he's already chosen back to the bad path. And then the Rambam says, he goes further, he contradicts himself, because we know the Rambam makes a famous statement in Hilchos Tshuva and Hilchos Melachim that a non-Jew who keeps the Sheva Mitzvahs, because they were given to Moshe Rabbeinu and Har Sinai, is considered one of the Chasidei Umot HaOlam, one of the righteous of the nations. But here, in Asurbia chapter 14, the actual halacha, because that statement in Hilchos Melachim is not halacha. I mean, that's his opinion, but the halacha, as brought down by Chazal, is that we tell them that only Israel has a share in the world to come. Only Israel. In other words, we're telling the Gentile this to encourage him further,
Right.
to
So that's good.
to nudge him in the right direction. But
Right.
it's
You want him to be. I mean, that's what I tell people as well. I mean,
right.
I don't say that a person is Gentile should just remain with the seven commands because, like Rabbi Chedek mentioned, the seven commands are just the minimum right to have existence. And if you fall below those seven, or if you break one of those seven, then the person's worthy of killed because they haven't been able to keep just a minimum set of laws, but they're not they're not a system of perfection. The best thing for a Gentile is the best thing for a Jew.
Absolutely.
Because again,
absolutely.
we come from the same couple. Everybody comes from Adam and Eve. There's no escaping that reality. So we're the same exact design. And God never reinvented man. And this whole concept about a Jewish soul that I heard recently. I told you I was speaking to a woman from Ecuador and how she hears an opinion and she couldn't believe that I told her that the Jews are not superior. She was brought up and she converted, but she and her mother and she were saying the whole area, what they hear from the Jewish camp, and even in Israel, in yeshivas, and even in Canada, this is the sense they get. There's a certain type of a feeling of neglect and that you're a little bit lower level if you're not Jewish. And that's something which there's no basis for. There's no additional soul. I mean, before Abraham was an idolater when he was younger, and then when he found God, there was no new soul. The Abraham that discovered God was the Abraham that was worshiping idols. So there was no this concept that people make up that he must have been giving a new soul, or this woman who converted, they asked her, now do you feel the extra soul now that you converted? And people, rabbis, even they have notions that they're brought up with, and they just repeat it, and there's no going back to the source and seeing, what's the Torah's words on these things? Where's this? I mentioned to you also that quote from Tanya that says the Jew has a piece of God, a chelik elokim mimal, a part of God from on high.
Chelik elokim mimal mamish, right?
Yeah, so they say it's a literal. So of course, you have the Rambam and you have your intelligence that tells you you can't have parts to God. Parts is a physical phenomena, and God says, "L'madin dam v'eshba." What are you going to equate me to? And I should be equal. I mean, what? I can't be similar to anything physical. And since the physical world is something which is subject to division, it's subject to parts, so God is not. You can't say there's a part of God. And there's also, it's heretical to say that.
I think I'm able to pinpoint where the confusion began. Now, clearly, I believe that a Torah-keeping Jew, mamish, a Torah-keeping Jew, of course, is superior to a non-Torah-keeping Gentile. But what makes that Jew special is that he's keeping Torah, right? I mean, in the Chumash it clearly says, whether you be my Am Segula if you keep my mitzvot. In other words, it's conditional. But not that you're special stam. In other words, or that you're born special, which is what's taught nowadays. And to touch on this idea of the Jewish soul, mind you, the idea of the Jewish soul was pretty much invented by the Zohar. Now, there's traces of it throughout Jewish history. There were Gnostics and other groups within the Jewish world before the Zohar that was created. I mean, with the Rasag, Rav Tzadok Gaon speaks about reincarnation even before the Zohar, or with the Ramban speaks about it. So there were these crazy ideas floating around, but the Zohar made the idea of a Jewish soul popular, with the idea that someone is special, not because what he believes and how those beliefs guide his behavior, but because he's born with a special spark, with the Pintele Yid within him. And
you have an open pasuk against it. God tells Cain, Adam's son, that if you want to, you can overcome your evil inclination, but if not, the pesach chatas rovetz, that the door of sin is crouched, waiting for you. So you, Cain, the son of Adam, the most perfect man, Ibn Ezra says he was a chacham gadol. Adam Arishon, Adam the first, was a chacham gadol. And his son, now God was addressing because he was jealous of his brother. His sacrifice was accepted, and Cain's was not because he didn't bring the best of his flock. So he now had, God was saying openly, you've two ways to go.
Right,
so
choice.
He
Free
had
will.
no inherently, he wasn't inherently good. There's no such thing as inherently good. It's a choice. It's not a birthright.
If any other group would espouse similar ideas, they would probably be called bigoted. And you know what? If you view these anti-Semites online, David Duke and all these silly individuals, they always pick and choose from all these Kabbalistic bigoted statements to misrepresent Judaism to the masses, saying this is what Torah teaches, this is what we're fighting against. And then, of course, it keeps Christians in Christianity because they're like, well, this is why we need Jesus, or this is why they needed Jesus to, in some way, bring a loving side to religion or a loving side to Torah. When the Torah was all we needed all along, but people just lost focus of the playbook. As a convert,
Yeah.
now mind you, I'm a convert myself. I converted 20 years ago. And regarding converts, those who espouse this idea of the Jewish soul basically teach that you cannot convert to Judaism, because if you do convert to Judaism, it's because you were Jewish all along,
Yeah, I've
which
heard that.
washes down the whole idea that the reason you would come to Torah is because it makes sense, because it's the only book that has civilized humanity. No, the only reason, according to the Kabbalists, you come to Torah is because you were in some way genetically drawn to it or spiritually drawn to it. Like the Torah itself does not have the power to change lives or to draw someone to God. This is something that I deal with on a daily basis. But
Is that your profession? Are you in the clergy? You're in the rabbinate?
yeah, I have a smicha. I mean, this is what I did in Israel for 5 years. I was a Makarov in Hebrew U for Jeff Seidel. And,
Oh, very good.
Yeah, and I also worked in the old city setting people up for Shabbos. And one day, in Israel, like when you're dealing with unaffiliated Jews, it's typically, birthright kids who are inquisitive individuals, not airheads, right? I mean, people who want serious answers to their serious questions. So I remember there was this one kid that we set up in the old city, with old city locals for Friday night, and the kid asked the Rav on why do you cover the challahs on the table, right? So the Rav mentions the Medrash so that the challahs don't get their feelings hurt when we give all the attention to the wine. So the kid laughs and asks the Rav if he really believes this. So long story short, the kid leaves before even the meal starts and probably turned his back on Judaism altogether because the Rav did not know how to properly explain what we believe. In other words, he didn't make a distinction between Kabbalah, between Midrashim, and things that we actually have to believe in, and was even willing to possibly lose a possible Choser B'Tshuva, then try to slightly play the rational card. Or this is why I think your website is so important, because it gives people options. It tells them that it's not only Breslov and Chabad, there's a rational camp out there that is still kosher, that, I mean, in my opinion, that was the derech of Chazal, like the way that our rabbis taught before Judaism took a mystical nosedive in the 13th century. And, if you have questions, we have answers. It doesn't always have to be a mystical one.
You have psukim. I think it's always vital to go back to the source. And you see how when why did God spend so much time, a year, and 10 plagues on Egypt? Because he wanted to expose their idolatry and their false gods as just that. And that's what the prophets go through, and they speak about. I remember Rabbi Che giving a beautiful explanation of the Haftorah of Vayikra, where the prophet tells the people that a person who's idolatrous, what does he do? He takes a tree, he cuts it in half. Half the tree, he lights on fire and cooks his food, and he warms himself. And the prophet even vocalizes what the person says. Ooh, I feel the warmth. Like he gets very, tangible about the description of how the tree is just firewood. And then the prophet goes on and says, but the other half, they take it, and they carve it into a god, and say, save me because you are my God. So what was the point of the prophet? He was trying to show, Rebbe should explain, that look at the contradiction. And I think that's the Haftarah where he says, Af yesh sheker be'yamini, but they don't see that I have falsehood in my right hand, meaning your left hand is calling it firewood, and your right hand is taking the same wood and carving it into a god. So the prophet is trying to bring the person to the most difficult, bridge to cross, and that is, look at what you're doing. You already admit that this is just firewood. So why are you then, your investment into this thing into a god is in a complete contradiction of what you just did to cook your food. So they tried to expose it, but this is to bring them back. This is to bring the idolater back. And when Moses said to the Jews that you should keep the statutes and laws, it's in the Deuteronomy, it's in 4:6, and he says that because this will be because when you keep the statutes of the Torah, this will be your understanding and your wisdom in the eyes of the other people, the other nations. And let's say, this nation is wise. So Moshe was concerned about the impression of the Gentiles. And again, you have the case where Moshe was told to God, and when God was going to kill the Jews after the sin of the gold calf. So what did Moshe say to God, famously? He says, what is Egypt going to say? That you took the Jews out of Egypt just to kill them on the mountain? So Moshe was concerned about the reputation God would have in the eyes of the other nations.
Right. In other words, what people think actually matters. But like I always said, whether being a makubal means never having to say you're sorry or never having to own up for the bad decisions that you've made. But
again, these were non-Jews that Moshe was concerned about.
Right, the nations.
And in all truth, Moshe and the tribes were no more quote-unquote Jewish than Paro. They just happened to come from different people. But there was no such thing as Judaism yet until God gave the Torah at Sinai. So everybody was, from Noah. Everybody was a Noahide in the world. Abraham, all the tribes, Paro, all the nations. Everybody was exact. That means all the exact same potential. And again, to say this concept that the Jew has a superior soul is arrogance. It turns off Jews. But this is what this unfortunate convert had told me, that when she was in the process of converting, and she was even teaching in Israel when she was in the yeshiva there, so they all looked down upon her because she had not yet converted yet, and that there was some inequality between people. But you look at it, who's the greatest kings? King David, King Solomon, and they came from Ruth, the convert. And Mashiach is coming from a convert. So what greater validation do we have to say that all people are equal, that God does not care who your parents are, he cares what you make yourself into?
The opinion that's most widely held by Chazal on who actually stood on Har Sinai, the opinion is that the Erev Rav outnumbered the Jews no matter who was giving over with the idea, teaching us that the Torah is not just the inheritance of the Jews. And mind you, the Rambam brings this up at the end of Hilchos Melachim. He says that the Torah is the inheritance of the Jews and all those who desire to convert. Now, why did he say those who desire to convert and not those who've already converted? Because it's not the conversion process itself, mamish, the conversion process that brings you in the covenant, but the decision that you made to follow the God of Israel and keep his Torah. Now, you still have to go through a conversion, absolutely. But this idea, whether you have Gentiles walking around, knowing that the Torah is true, 100% true, but being encouraged to do less is unheard of. I mean, it's not just unheard of, it's unethical. I mean, mind you, there were no Noahide communities in Jewish history. Like what there was were Gentiles called God-fearers, which were people who kept all of Torah, but for some reason couldn't go through a formal conversion process for political reasons. Maybe they would have been persecuted or killed in many instances. The Torah is for everybody. So this is why a Gentile should get as equally offended as we do when someone misrepresents Torah and misrepresents our God, because they're misrepresenting their Torah and their God.
To your point, and you may want to take a look on the chat, Chaya has a question, so maybe you want to address it. But before you do, I just want to validate what you're saying, that in another place in the Rambam, which is the last law in Shmita and Yovel, so he says that anybody, Kol Bo'ei Olam, he says not only does Shevet Levi have God's divine providence, that he takes care of them, because they don't have land, they don't work the fields, so where do they get their sustenance from? The Jews all contribute. They give tithes to the Kohanim and to the Levium. So that's where God supports them. In order that they're the learning group of Israel, So at least you have one group that's dedicated to Torah study and teaching. So that's a great system. But Rambam says there, in Shmita Yovel, Yud Gimel, he says that not only Shevet Levi Bilvad, but he says anybody who comes into the world, and it does not say any Jew. He says anybody who comes into the world that breaks off his neck the yoke of calculations that people seek. Like they're always so concerned about money and this and that. But this certain person, no matter who he or she is, and he devotes himself and dedicates his life to follow God as God created him or her, so then he is called Kodesh Kodashim, Holy of Holies, and God is his lot, and God will give him or her whatever is necessary to sustain this person because they're dedicated themselves to learning and teaching. Jew or non-Jew.
Right. So that goes completely against the first two prakim in the Tanya that teach that Gentiles come from the Sitra Achra, from the unclean klipot, have souls akin to animals.
Yeah.
So there's for sure a conflict of interest here, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. In other words, we can't put this Kabbalistic cat back in the bag. It's out already. What do we do with people who have adopted these ideas into their theology? And like I told you earlier, I have friends who are rationalists but quasi-mystical. How would you reason that out? Or what status would you give to these individuals?
Well, they have to go to the, I don't know what status. I would be concerned that they first confront the authentic sources, which is, like I mentioned, that our greatest kings came from converts, and that Moshiach is going to be from a convert, from the same lineage, and that Abraham, who served idols, then had a concern to learn the truth. He did, and then he started teaching. He had tens of thousands of followers, I believe Rambam says, and then God made Abraham into a leader. Why? Because Abraham showed concern to teach all of mankind. That was his primary claim to fame, that he went out and he was thrown into prison, and the story of him being in the furnace, that
But the Rambam actually brings it down like a mitzvah. In the third positive commandment in Sefer Mitzvot, the mitzvah of loving Hashem, he says, how do you fulfill the mitzvah of loving Hashem? By doing what Avram Avinu did in Haran. And as you know, all the Meforshim, all the commentators believe that he proselytized, he reached out and brought Gentiles in. What they teach that he converted the men and Sarah converted the women. So at least according to the Rambam, he brings it down like an actual chovah, like an obligation, as one of the Torah mitzvot.
That's very good. But you see, God endorsed his lifestyle because he went out and reached people with the truth. But what were the arguments that the Medrash talks about? The arguments he used were not mystical. He destroyed all the idols except for one. His father comes home, and the father says, what happened to all the idols? So Abraham said to his father, that one over there that's still standing, destroy them all. Mm-hmm. In order to bring that point out in a rational way to his father. No mysticism. And there was no such ideas. This was only which was idolatrous. I mean, we know that Adam's grandson started worshiping the stars. Abraham talks about that. But where in the Torah do you have any of these things like the red bendel, or praying at the Western Wall, or putting notes in graves? This is nowhere to be found in the Torah. Everything is pure, rational. It's praying to God whenever you have a need. Man is not to be held up to be magical in any way. And as a matter of fact, the Jews were always rebelling against Moshe because they didn't have this concept of the mystical man. That was something which they were scared when they miscounted and they thought he wasn't coming down from the mountain. So then that group, the Egyptian, the mixed multitude, to answer Chaya's question, that they came out of Egypt. So they created this calf. They needed some sort of a physical, tangible medium because the pasuk, the verse says over there that they came to Aaron and they said to Aaron, Moses, the man who took us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. So why does the pasuk say Moses, the man who took us out of Egypt? They should have just said, we don't know what happened to Moses, because they started counting too soon. That's why they miscounted. But the fact that they said Moses, the man who took us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. What they're saying is they were very attached to the physical man, Moses. That's why they made a physical calf. But in terms of these, the superior soul and, and these powers of a red bendel, you think it's protecting you. Again, this is all conjured up. And the Torah speaks completely against all this, that the people shouldn't be sacrificing to demons because there's no evidence of demons. There's no evidence of any of this beliefs that people have. Or people put mezuzahs on their houses, and they think it's protecting them physically. So the Rambam says openly that a person like that loses his olam haba because he's taking a mitzvah that teaches the most fundamental command, to know that God is one. God one, meaning one, means there is no other. There is no other power. Mm-hmm. And they're taking this, and now they're making it into a protection of their body and their homes. And the Shulchan Aruch says it too. I think it's the Gilyon Marsha brings it down. He says if a person thinks by keeping the mitzvah of the mezuzah, so then they're going to be protected, to have some reward, that's okay, because there is a concept of reward for mitzvah. But, he says, if you think that it's a protective device itself, and it's not through reward and punishment, but the mezuzah per se is a protective device, see, the Gilyon Marsha says, then the mezuzah will be knives in your eyes. Meaning, every time you look at it, it's going to damage you because you have a false belief.
Going forward, that we live in a mystical world. The Jewish world as it exists today, I would say is around... I'm sorry?
Take a look at Chaya. I want to just, Chaya's online. She's got some questions. Do you see it on the chat?
Let's see. Yeah, it says regarding a ger toshav. I think this is not the ideal for Torah because the Rambam says that only a ger tzedek will be accepted in the Messianic era. The ger toshav is only a compromise for people who do not want to convert completely. So the Rambam says that a ger toshav is only accepted during the Messianic era. The way he says it, it's accepted when the Yovel years is kept again, i.e., that when Mashiach comes, because we don't keep the Jubilee nowadays, right? But technically, a ger toshav cannot exist under that premise. Now, the Kesef Mishnah steps in and says, no, a ger toshav could be accepted at any time, and that's pretty much what the Noahide movement goes with the opinion of Rav Yosef Karo in that area, but it clearly contradicts the Rambam. So people pick and choose what they want to help this movement go forward, which was really birthed in the 60s, this whole Noahide movement, i.e. Ger Toshav movement. Now, the Ger Toshav Noahide movement, or the Noahide laws, is clearly a real thing, right? I mean, Chazal mentioned 7 laws, right? But for all intents and purposes, all one has to believe, Midrashim aside, is that these were laws developed by the Beis Din HaGadol, like by the Sanhedrin, to adjudicate Gentiles living on Jewish lands. Now, there's other Midrashim that teach that 6 laws were given to Adam HaRishon and the last law given to Noach. Fine. Regardless, that what we're forced to believe is that Gentiles living on Jewish lands are only adjudicated by these 7 laws. I mean, the Rambam writes in the end of Hilchos Malachim that if a Gentile breaks any of these 7 laws, he's Chayav Misa. And he goes further to say that even if he steals a Sheva Pruta, you have to kill him. So it's...
He keep his minimum system.
Right.
He broke minimal system.
Right. But it's not what people should aspire to be. Especially nowadays, anyone coming from a Christian or Muslim background, it would really be taking a step back, not just spiritually, but ethically, to try to force yourself to live by 7 laws. Because you're doing more than that already. So the goal in this life is to go from a lower state of holiness to a higher state of holiness. Now, mind you, if you just want to keep 7 laws, fine. Here, the Rambam teaches that if someone just keeps 7 laws, acknowledging where these laws came from, then they also have a place in the world to come. This is the Rambam's opinion. There's other rabbis who disagree, but that's fine. But that's not how it's taught nowadays. Nowadays, it's taught as an alternative to Torah. That means someone's convinced that Torah is true. No, but they're telling you, why would you want to become a Jew when you could remain a Gentile? Like regarding what Avram Avinu was actually teaching in Haran, in Masechet Avodah Zorah Daf Tet, it says that the era of Torah began with Avram Avinu seeking converts in Haran. So he was teaching Torah. Now, I'm not of the opinion that Avram Avinu had the whole Torah, but whatever he had, that's when the era began. So that really gives us a glimpse of what we should be doing. I mean, mind you, the Rambam writes also in Sefer Mitzvahs that it's a mitzvah to emulate Hashem. Well, just like He's merciful, we should strive to be merciful. To take that a little further, just how He gave us a Torah, we should offer the Torah to others. Because that's the way we make this world a better place. By making more Torah-keeping Jews. It's just practical, it's rational. However, being a mystic, like I said, means never having to say you're sorry, not owning up for the disaster or the carnage what you leave behind. If the Gentile world would have only been keeping 7 laws during World War II, who would have liberated the camps? I mean, there's no mitzvah for a goy to fight evil. It's the Torah.
I agree 100% that the human perfection is the same for everyone, and the Jews' perfection is equal to the Gentiles' perfection, and we should really encourage, we don't go out with any type of force or proselytizing, but we make it available, and I try to do that also, whether you're out exercising and you meet somebody who's Gentile on the street, you get them, engage them in conversation, maybe that's the one opportunity he's going to have in a couple of years to be in contact with a religious Jew and hear some ideas that really, resound in his mind is intelligent, like all other parts of his life that he's trying to live intelligently.
There's a famous tshuva of the Rambam where he says that it's mutter to teach Torah to Notrim, to Christians, to draw them to it says, detenu, our religion. But then he goes on to say that one shouldn't try this with Muslims because they'll use it against you. So here, even the Rambam's saying it's okay to encourage Gentiles through education to come to Torah.
Yeah, I mean, this should really be our concern. We should be caring, just like Moshe Rabbeinu cared about Egypt and God, if you kill the Jews after the Egel, so what's Egypt going to say? It's going to be a stain on your reputation, and that's what you want for the world. And all the prophets talked about the future, that all the nations will flow into Israel, and they'll say that our forefathers inherited Sheker Yichalu Avosenu. Our forefathers bequeathed to us falsehood. They'll start seeing the truth. Mashiach is going to be an intelligent human being that's going to teach the world and show exactly, and show the world exactly what the truth is, and they will recognize it at that point. But we talk about that. That takes part of the Torah. Part of the Torah is anticipating the other nations to follow God, just like we do. Now, there's 2 reasons for that. One is that we're concerned about them, but another one, which I'm just paraphrasing Rabbi Chait, that now shows a completion. On that day, God's name will be one, and his God will be one, and His name will be one. Meaning, until that point, so God's reign over the world is not completed because it's a stain. It's tarnished for His reputation. How come so many of His creations are not following Him, but they're following idolatry in the form of Christianity and other religions, or atheism, or pantheism?
It's a valid opinion amongst Chazal that the whole world will convert to Judaism. I'm not saying that everyone held like this, but it says in Masechet Brachot 56, I think it's Amud Aleph, it says that why did the Navi say that they were worshiping with pure lips? Pure lips means Hebrew. That the nations are going to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Hebrew, i.e. they're going to become Jewish. And there, where they teach that the whole world will convert to Judaism. But I think that the biggest problem we have nowadays is going forward. In other words, every year we have newer Kabbalistic ideas arising. And what I try to do in many of my lectures is help people learn Judaism properly, teaching them the distinction between halacha and midrashim.
Good. Very good.
Because the problem didn't arise with the Zohar. I mean, there are many ideas that appear in Agadot, in midrashim from the time of the Tanaim and the Amoraim. For example, people with davening at graves. And there's a famous medrash talks about Kalev, where he goes to Hebron and he prostrates himself on Avram Avinu's kever, and he begins to beseech him with requests, right? So when we see people doing that at the Ohel, this is where they're going to quote. Now, the Rambam at the end of the Hilchos Oval He says that one's not allowed to pray Arba Amot to a kever. But what do you tell the person who's just going to pull a medrash out and say, oh, well, but like many of our sages thought it was okay, right?
Well, I would tell the person on the spot, on that Gemara, that Sota, I think it's 56, and it says, on the spot, Tosfos says that Kalev did not pray to the dead people. And they quote the pasuk that says, Ein Mesam Yodem Uma. They quote that the dead don't know anything, in order to substantiate the fact that Kalev was not praying to the dead. What he was praying to God. This is Tosfos, right there on the page. And he prayed to God, and then God communicated to the patriarchs who are now dead, because the patriarchs are not dead in the sense that they don't exist anymore, they're just not on earth. But their souls exist in Olam Haba. We can't communicate to them, but God certainly can and does. So Kalev did not pray to the dead. So we have no source, even from that medrash. Tosfos was clear on the spot to say that he was not communicating to the dead, because that would be a violation of,
If it's a knowledgeable Jew, like he'll say, Tosfos is a Rishon, right? I mean, Rabbeinu Tam, this is much later. Versus a Tana or an Amara. In other words, they'll be like, that's later opinions.
But there's also the pasuk. It says in the Torah, El Mesim Lo Sidrashu, don't inquire of the dead. And in a broad sense, that means that there's no communication with the dead. So that's a Torah verse. That's from God.
For sure. I understand that. Yeah, but there's another medrash or another statement. It's typically understood that any statement amongst Chazal that's not of a legal nature falls into the realm of a Gadata or a medrash. But there's another one where they actually build a yeshiva on top of a kever because they found out that I think it was like the kever of the Rebbe.
Yeah, the intermediary, the Chaya. Chaya is saying right now on the chat, she's saying that aren't we forbidden from the Torah from beseeching the dead? Right. So I just quoted that for you. And she says that in intermediaries, in prayer is universal in all religions. It might be universal, but openly we do not work with intermediaries because God can hear a person no matter where he is. That's why it's a foolish concept to pray at the Western Wall or to think that any one location is any more significant in terms of God knowing your needs.
Mm-hmm. Mind you, it was the Arizal that made the Western Wall possible. There's an old medrash that spoke about a wall in Yerushalayim, but nobody knew exactly where this wall was. Actually, all the Kivrei Sadiqim in Tzfat was also from the Arizal's inspiration. He would walk around, obviously I don't believe this, but he would walk around saying, this person was buried here, this Tana was buried there. And he did the same in the Western Wall. And this is why Judaism looks the way it does nowadays, because of the influence of the Arizal, which was probably the closest thing Judaism ever had to a warlock. In other words, I don't think that what he taught was kosher.
Again, we have to go back to the authority on what we do and believe can't be what the population is doing or what is popular today, or what people who supposedly call themselves more religious and try to externalize religiosity through dress, which is against the Torah. The Torah in Sephania, Aleph Ches, the first chapter in Sephania, who's a prophet, and it's 1:8 in Sephania, and it says that God punished the Jews because they were wearing malbish nachri, strange garments. And the Radak, on the spot, Rav David Kimchi says, if you look, he gives three different explanations. In the third explanation of what strange garments were, that the Jews, for some reason, they were getting punished for wearing strange garments. What's wrong with that? But the Radak says they were dressing in a way, these Jews, to look more righteous than their brothers. That means that this is against the Torah to try to use dress and any external expression to try to show I am more pious than someone else. That is why the temples were destroyed. It's called sinas chinam. It's a measure of hatred or contempt for some other person, and you want to raise yourself up, just like Lashon Hara, but now you're going to use clothing, and now you're going to dress a certain way and style your hair a certain way. These things are not in the Torah because it's irrelevant. Your relationship is supposed to be like the Navi says. He says, that you're supposed to be humble with God, meaning you don't externalize, which is impossible anyway, but you can't externalize your religiosity. Religiosity is your concepts, your ideas about God, how you practice, whether you're with people, whether you're not, and this is completely against. And unfortunately, people today look at exteriors and they'll deem people who dress a certain way as more religious than people who are wearing a plain shirt and a pair of jeans. And they have no idea how to express. I mean, that's only God. That's what God told Shmuel when he was going to anoint the next king after King Saul had sinned by keeping the king alive, Agag. So God sends Shmuel, and Shmuel had this concept about being able to assess. He says, I'm a Navi. He called himself a Navi. So God wanted to reprimand him. So he sends Shmuel to the house of Yishai, and said, all right, I'm going to show you who my next king is going to be. So when he got there, and I think Eliav is the one that he saw, the oldest, and he looked at him, he was tall, he was handsome, and he said, oh, this must be God's new king. So God says, no, don't look at his appearance. Don't look at his height. Don't look at his countenance. Because Adam Yireh Einayim, man looks with the eyes, but Hashem Yireh but Hashem looks into the heart of a person. So again, we have an example in the Torah where exterior assessment is completely false, and God's telling you, look at the interior. So this, I agree that there are a lot of things that became popular now in terms of what people look at as religious and who they take their cues from in terms of who they think is living properly. But that's not the way to assess what Judaism is. You have to look at what God said, and you have the Talmud, and you don't have any of this nonsense there.
Mm-hmm. The main issue here is that Jews shouldn't be excluding other Jews, but just because they choose not to believe a certain mystical idea. For example, if a Jew, and I've heard this happen many times, that an Orthodox Jew comes to the realization that all these things are optional to believe. And I'm not quick to say that the Zohar is bad or Kabbalah is bad. The word I like to use is optional to believe. So they walk into a shul or into the yeshiva and say, okay, I happen not to believe in this idea. And they'll call him a kofar. They'll call him an apokoris. And they will exclude him from the fold because he chooses not to embrace, again, an optional idea. And so you know how many kids decide to give Judaism a chance? And I'm not talking about non-Jews. I'm talking about unaffiliated Jews who try to give Judaism a chance and get bombarded with so many mystical ideas that they run away and they never look back again over things that are optional to believe. Right.
We have to keep on speaking and bringing it out to people. And there's no other way to do it. We have to counter these type of concepts. Ultimately, Mashiach is going to be the one who will bring that to a head. Chai is asking about, we're talking about clothing, and she's saying, but weren't the Jews, didn't they merit freedom because of three things? They didn't change their names, the language, and the clothing. So isn't the fact that they kept their clothing distinct, isn't that something good? But let me just also tell you that Rashi says that when the Jews were pillaging the Egyptians after the Red Sea, and the sea had spat up all the Egyptians, so the Jews can see that the Egyptians are not going up on the other side, escaping, but they're dead. So God wanted the Jews to have peace of mind finally. But it says the Jews collected the silver and the gold and the clothing from the Egyptians at that moment after they died. And Rashi says, they took the silver, the gold, but it says the last thing in the verse, it says they took their clothing. Because the last thing in the verse is what the Jews found most desirous. Mm-hmm. So Rashi's telling you that there's nothing wrong with wearing the clothing of another nation as long as it's not used for idolatrous purpose. You can't wear the garments of a priest because that's garments, those are clothing for religious practice. But there's nothing wrong with wearing an Izod shirt or
even the practices. I mean, if the practices of the nation don't contradict Torah, it's not hukasakum. It's not.
Yeah, right. Exactly. If they're doing
pagan by association. Right.
If a person who's not Jewish wears a green shirt to go golfing, that does not prohibit you from wearing a green shirt. Now, it is interesting what Chai is bringing up that when it says that the Jews merited the redemption because they didn't change their names, their language, and their clothing. Now, I'm just wondering if what you can say is that it's not necessarily a praise of the Jews, it could be saying that they didn't go that far, meaning there was still something they retained. It's showing that the level that they steeped to was very far, and this is the only things left that they didn't change.
Again, but that's just a medrash, and there's other midrashim that I encounter this. It's so I try not to build too much on midrashim. I mean, stick.
Yeah.
We have a famous saying, "Ein mikra yotzei midei peshuto," right? But
Right.
that the Torah, that a pasuk doesn't depart from its literal understanding. And I think some midrashim are beautiful, and I think some are less so. But to say that we have to take every midrash seriously is why we have this mystical problem today. Judaism is ultimately Torah shebiktav, with the literal text of the Torah, and Torah shebal peh. The rulings, the halachas, how we keep and how we understand with Torah shebiktav.
Even the Rambam in the guide, the Moreh Nevuchim, the guide for perplexed, when he talks about trials and tests that God brings to man, so he quotes a Gemara in Brachos, and I think he says there it's 5a in Brachos, and he says that some of the rabbis in the Gemara like the idea of afflictions of love, but he disagrees with it. You see, the Rambam himself he's not a medrash, he's disagreeing with the Gemara, meaning he's disagreeing with opinion of a certain rabbi, and it's not a halacha, because they're talking about philosophy there. So, like Rabbi Shade explained, that a rabbi, nobody can tell you what you can't think. There's nobody that can tell you that you must believe X, Y, or Z. Either you believe it or you don't. A rabbi's jurisdiction is only over what to do, to act. Halacha, that's what the word halacha means, how you act, how you go in life. So there, you don't have to agree with the halacha or not. You have to do it to keep the Torah intact. But when it comes to thinking and philosophy, there's no such thing as legislating what you believe, because nobody can say you believe something if you don't. You have to arrive at that through your own, free will and your own ability to think for yourself, and that's so important.
I think one other thing that created the problem that we have today, this mystical problem, is the idea that everything was given in Har Sinai. Now, mind you, not all of our sages didn't believe that every particular law was given in Har Sinai. Well, the reason this is problematic is because there are many people who also will toss in Sefer HaBahir or toss in the Zohar and say, oh, well, this was also given on Har Sinai. Right? So it's very dangerous from, let's say, a mystical perspective, because it's typically the approach set over by mystics that everything, even what rabbis say today, was given in Har Sinai. In other words, they use Har Sinai as an excuse to get their own works and ideas validated with the pen of divine inspiration. Right?
But there's a problem with that, because if you say that all the rabbis' words were divinely given at Sinai, what do you do with all the thousands of disputes in the Gemara where the rabbis disagree with each other?
Right. In the Gemara itself, Masechet Torayot comes down in the Rambam and Mishnah Torah as Hilchot Shegagot. In other words, it deals with the errors of the rabbis, with the errors of the Sanhedrin, and what they had to, what korban they had to bring when they ruled erroneously. But of course, if you read the Tanya, with the notion of Benoni, of a tzaddik who doesn't sin. Now, according to the Rambam, a tzaddik is someone whose good deeds outweigh his bad deeds. But suddenly, Kabbalistic Judaism would lead you to believe that a tzaddik is someone who doesn't sin.
Well, that's a saint. That's a Christian concept.
Right, absolutely.
And we don't have that. King Solomon said it openly. Ein tzaddik, ein adam tzaddik v'aretz sheyasa tov lo yafta. There's no man who is righteous in the land who does good and does not sin. So King Solomon, who was the wisest man next to Moses, said this already. That
Litvaks have a similar concept. I mean, it was taught by Agudas Yisrael with the notion of Das Torah, with that a Gadol is a Sefer Torah Chai, like he's a walking Sefer Torah, i.e. he doesn't make mistakes. So even in the more rationalist camp, where the nonsense exists, there's a big battle ahead of us. But regarding proselytizing, I don't have a problem with proselytizing, and I don't have a problem admitting that I proselytize. But the question is, what does it mean to proselytize? Now, proselytize doesn't mean to go door to door with telling people that if you don't accept this, you're going to hell. No, it's pretty much just having an open door policy, being willing to answer questions, being willing to be welcoming. I mean, similar to what the Muslims do. Islam is the fastest growing religion out there, and you don't see them on the street corners trying to convince someone to become religious. No, they'll have their classes online, and I think that's one of the great things and great advantages of the internet. And this is why there's so many people coming to Torah now, because the information is made available. So if
Yeah.
we just make that information available, and of course fix the conversion crisis we have nowadays, that in many places, I would say in around 90% of the world, conversions aren't even allowed. Like, for example, the Rabbanut has outlawed conversions in South America off of the Syrian takana of not accepting converts, and Israel has reversed conversions. So there's a big crisis on how long it should take to convert, who should be allowed to convert. I have a video explaining that according to the Rambam and according to Chazal, conversions took about a day. It says that if someone comes to convert today, you inform him of some of the mitzvot, like some of the light ones and some of the heavy ones, and then it says that you inform him again that when he's already in the water. So this isn't a 1-year conversion program. This is, if he wasn't circumcised, of course we have to wait like for the circumcision to heal. That means it took 1 day if you're a woman and about 30 days for that circumcision to heal if you were a man in order to convert, not 1, 2, 3 years
Yeah.
to what we see today. And that's if people even bother to do conversions. You know,
And we should be doing this. We should be doing this free of charge, not like I saw in one of your videos. You said there's some people are charging $10,000 for a conversion.
that's common, unfortunately. That
Oh, that's a real shame. We should really publicize that whoever wants to convert, we'll help them do it at minimal or no cost in order that they can really benefit. Money should not.
that's controversial. You know, I've been kicked out of more synagogues just on my stance of accepting converts than on any other issue. Just because hypothetically, when I see a religious Gentile, I really see a Torah Jew fighting to get out. And
Right.
the way you fight bad religion is with good religion. It's not with no religion. So I think whether we should take advantage, it would behoove us to take advantage of this time that we have many people who are coming to us to learn and nudge them in the right direction. Because there's ultimately no difference between a Gentile and a Jew apart from Torah. That's it.
That's right.
When the Rambam calls a
Where-
Jew who doesn't keep Shabbos, he calls him kegoy, equivalent to a Gentile.
Right.
But nowadays, like when you see Lubavitcher standing on the street corner asking everyone, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? Right? Not asking them if you accept Torah or like if you believe in God. No, but separating the world between Jew and Gentile instead of between those who are ethical and those who are not.
Right.
It's primitive, and I think it's the last primitive belief that we have to do away with, the idea that blood matters.
Right.
But
Yeah, again, we have all the sources. All the sources trump. Unfortunately, today we live in a very social society, especially the Jewish communities, where even within those communities, they have to have their own type of shul, and I'm from a different sect than you, and they dress a different way. So there's a lot of this, like you said earlier, these lines that people delineate. But it's all ego. It's all arrogance, because they have to have a shul that they go to and a shul that they don't go to. They have to show I am somehow better, and this ego keeps on pushing out and looking for expression in clothing.
we are our
and
worst
the minhagim
enemies. It's a thing. you
Yeah,
know.
it's really, as opposed to, like you're saying, people, human beings, we're supposed to have a love for all creatures. The fact God created all the nations means He wants them to exist, and the fact that they have a soul just like we do, and we got to be clear to people that this whole concept of a superior Jew or superior Jewish soul is not found in the Torah. It's a complete erroneous and arrogant.
It's not found in the Talmud
position.
either, by the way.
Right?
Yeah, but it all ties
Right.
in to how we relate to Gentiles nowadays. Well, the reason conversion takes so long and why they push people away so hard is because of these ideas. There's a statement of Esav Lasona Yaakov. This mystical idea that Gentiles intrinsically hate Jews just because they exist. Of course, if you believe this, if you believe that Gentiles come from the unclean klipot, come from the sitra achra, are almost irredeemable, why would you want to welcome a convert into your people?
Well, they're going to come up and say that at the conversion, their soul was exchanged. They make up nonsense. But the bottom line is there was no such thing as a Jew in Abraham's time. and yet God loved him and spoke to him. Now, is God speaking to any Jew today? Is anybody a prophet today? No. So Abraham, who was not a Jew, who was a Gentile, he was a Noahide, like everybody else back then, God spoke to him and loved him. And God said that in the Torah, because the dativ. And I know he's in the command his household afterwards, and teach them the way, the Derech Hashem. So God said, this is a man that's perfect, and he made the whole nation of the Jews from Abraham, who was not a Jew. And people have just got to wrap their heads around this and realize
the Erev
that there's a
Rav.
complete...
I'm not of the opinion, and mind you, there's two opinions regarding the Erev Rav. Now, one opinion was that they were just absorbed into Israel. There's one medrash in Midrash Rabbah that says that the best and the brightest of Mitzrayim that followed Moshe Rabbeinu were praised by the Almighty. And then there's another medrash that teaches that they were the ones responsible for the golden calf and all this stuff. I'm of the opinion that the vast majority of individuals who stood in Har Sinai were not of Hebrew stock and accepted the Torah, Nasiv and Ishma, like everybody else, and were eventually absorbed into the Jewish people, teaching us that God doesn't pick favorites, that at every time in history, it wasn't about a relationship between God and a specific genetic people, but God and anyone who wants to follow him. The vision was one God, worshipped in one manner by all types of people. And that's what my ministry tries to push.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't call it a ministry.
I'm trying to think another word. Like in Hebrew, it's amutah, my website. Fine.
Right. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to wrap this up now, but I want to do this again, so I'll be in touch with you, but I would also welcome you if you would like to submit articles, videos for the Masorah site, or articles for the Jewish Times. Let's get additional your voice out there, and let's attract people, Jew and non-Jew alike, to an approach to the correct, validated view of what Torah is, based on the Torah verses, number one, meaning what God said, and of course what Moshe said and how Abraham acted, and then of course the Gemaras and Rambam, who one of our greatest codifiers of the law, and the Shulchan Aruch is primarily based on the Rambam, and we should really try to purify, to distill truth, and address also false ideas, but do it in a way where we're really showing very clearly and succinctly, in a compelling, honest form, what Judaism's position is on things, and what its philosophy or halacha. I would like to focus primarily on what the fundamentals of Judaism are, so people could start saying, yeah, that makes sense, and all this other stuff, this hocus pocus, that really there's no validation, and there's no evidence to it. So let's try to do that together, and
my biggest issue is not with people believing Kabbalistic ideas, but by people excluding others from their shuls, from their families, because of certain ideas, instead of saying, like, what unites us is Torah Shebaal Peh and Torah Shebiktav, and everything else is fluff. If you want to believe it, fine, but I'm not going to kick you out of my shul just because you don't want to believe in Gegolim or in any other mystical idea. So
fundamentals first. Right. That should really be what I think. If people have that, they'll be able to answer a lot of their other questions. But they're not being taught the fundamentals in school, and I don't know what yeshivas are really. I mean, they're going through Gemara, they're going through Halacha, but are they going through what distinguishes Judaism? How do we prove that Judaism is true and all other religions are false? And how do we validate the fundamentals and understand why God gave 10 Commandments and stone? And he also gave a scroll. There's acts that God did that have to be asked, and in order to point us in the direction is what are the real foundations, and the 7 mitzvos, the Sheva mitzvos b'nei Noach. Why those? What is what's primary about them? And I think if we bring these out as a foundation, and we're speaking a language that people don't have to have a lot of background of Talmud to know, so we could appeal to a very large audience. I'd like to do that with you.
I hear you. Well, I appreciate your time, and thank you for allowing me to be on your show.
Okay, and we'll continue doing this, Usher.
Okay. All right, Tizkol Mitzvahs.
Okay, and I enjoyed hearing a lot of the Torah that you said tonight. I learned a lot from you.
Thank you, likewise. All right, be well.
Okay, be well. I'll be in touch.
All right,